Welcome once again. It's Career Coaching After Hours with me, John Davidson, your host and semi-famous YouTuber. Well, hopefully. All right. So once again, we've got Ghostrifter on the GJ panel, and I thank you for joining me. Can you believe it's already episode 11 of Career Coaching After Hours? I can hardly believe it. Happy Halloween, everyone. I'll be dropping this a little bit later today, so some of you might be seeing it here in November, but we're still in the midst of the Q4 scramble. So have a happy and safe Halloween, and I hope your November and December are also great. So in this episode, I want to dig a little bit deeper into RTO, Return to Office. And in case you've been reading the news in the last few months, it's been there quite a bit, especially among bigger tech companies, especially since Amazon has made some pretty big moves and quite a bit of intel out there suggesting that in 2025, this coming year, that perhaps the entire company will be marching back to the office. RTO, Return to Office, capital letters. And thanks, Microsoft Designer, for helping me build such a cool graphic for the thumbnail. I think that about sums it up. Some googly-eyed products there in an Amazon box. Maybe we're all getting shipped on back to the office. So let's dig in a little bit. I'll be covering some articles I've seen more so in the last week from a few different sources. And as usual, if you have some ideas or comments, feel free to leave those here in the video. I do appreciate those. And all right, with my usual disclaimer slides, this series is more audience agnostic. Likely I'm not your career coach, and if I am, I have to be hush-hush about it. So my hope with this series is certainly it's an opportunity for me to dig into some topics that clients bring up, maybe highlight some issues in the news in kind of a chill platform. Of course, you'll hear the tunes in the background, but all the links will actually be in the notes there, right there on YouTube if you'd like those. And if there are any broken links, please let me know. But I try my best to pull in some citations. And again, a lot of the RTO discussion is to the best of my knowledge. So I'm trying to provide some relatively new intel, as it's kind of an ongoing issue that we've seen, arguably since the pandemic is wrapped up. Companies struggling, employers rather, public and private, struggling with this idea of kind of getting back into work. So do check your sources. Feel free to check my sources. I try to provide a solid range of different outlets, what have you. All right, so back to the debate, to return to office or not to return to office, raises a lot of really hot button questions. And we'll touch on this, but you could make a really good argument that Amazon is one of the big employers here in the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest and in Seattle. And yes, they do have an HQ too, that maybe when a big company like Amazon makes waves related to RTO, that casts an oversized shadow. Maybe not just here in the Pacific Northwest, but maybe on the tech market and across the West Coast. And maybe that's a sign to other tech companies in terms of what may be coming. So is this a portent of something else? Well, maybe. But arguably hard to ignore all the RTO noise in the news or rumblings. But I'm going to point out an issue that I don't think gets covered in the press all that often, is that RTO doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. So even if your employer has a general RTO policy, maybe there's some flexibility or some gray area that we should discuss. Or even a tech company like Microsoft or Amazon or Apple or Google maybe shouldn't utilize a broad policy for all workers all across North America. Maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room there. So I'll zip on through, but a lot of what we've been seeing in the news, I think, makes some really good points about, whether it's Amazon or other employers, that maybe RTO is a function of some other bigger issues. maybe the cooling jobs market. We've been seeing some really interesting spikes and dips here in 2024. So are we in a recession? Is the job market kind of landing on its feet? We've seen some historic revisions to Bureau of Labor Statistics data. I think that's absolutely worth exploring, that perhaps a company like Amazon, maybe RTO as a policy is buyouts in disguise, quote unquote, or maybe a reaction to changing market conditions, some insecurities about the job market, labor market, supply chains, or maybe a reaction to AI. Oh my gosh, is that a possibility? Well, maybe. Brings up some really interesting questions, as in, if an RTO policy gets put into place, is that maybe to kind of stop the flow of loss related to maybe lower revenue, or maybe just being more efficient and needing fewer people in the organization? So let's enact a policy that maybe nudges some folks out. But here's a really interesting article from The Hill. I don't always cite to them, but kind of an interesting quote here, and they're pulling some data from Gartner, which I think is usually pretty reliable. But maybe RTO isn't just something that rank and file folks have to be concerned with. I think it's a really good point. I think this maybe doesn't get the attention it should. What about executives? What about director level, VP level on up? And so I thought this was a really interesting stat. 1/3 of executives faced with in-office work mandates plan to leave, which is really kind of interesting. It's like RTO gets put into force and just leave. And this is in the face of, for example, the new CEO of Starbucks having arguably a pretty flexible policy there with a private jet and not necessarily having to be in the office all the time. So maybe pretty stark contrast to what we're seeing at Amazon. So I think that's an interesting one to take a look at, that RTO maybe isn't just something that affects teachers or programmers, aerospace professionals, but maybe sales executives, vice presidents, different layers, echelons of folks in different industries. So I think well worth taking a look at. As a sweeping policy literally affects everyone. I think it raises some really interesting questions as to, if there is an RTO policy, for example, at your employer, well, does that affect everybody the same way, or is there some wiggle room? And I'll get into that a little bit later too, but I thought this was actually really interesting here. This is just a few days ago from Business Insider. So we think of Andy Jassy, the current CEO of Amazon, who has a pedigree of AWS. Here's their current AWS CEO, Matt Garman. We're now kind of getting some feedback and some backlash from employees about RTO. And I think that's really interesting when you get 500 employees signing a letter, maybe a step or two below a strike or something like that, a la Boeing, kind of criticizing that mandate to return to the office 5 days a week. And that's a pretty big leap. So imagine you're an Amazonian and you don't have to go into the workplace more than 3 days a week, and suddenly it's almost doubled. So you go from 3 to 5. That could be a really sharp shift. What if you are a caretaker for children or elderly parents? Or what if you've got a part-time MBA program rolling? And so arguably not a lot of ramp to go from 3 to 5. That's a pretty sizable shift. And even in the last year or so, we've seen these kind of shifts at companies like Twitter or Apple, where this kind of seismic shift, maybe folks will just kind of get up and leave. So there's that. And, arguably some different feedback around how many folks really want to be in the office. But to be a little bit of to play the devil's advocate role a bit, are there some benefits to being in the office? I'm a bit biased. Yes, I think there are, but I also think you have really interesting questions about RTO. If you're too sharp on that, and maybe if the requirement is always 4, always 5, you might not be able to attract the level of talent that you might be able to get when you're a little bit more flexible, maybe 3 days a week in the office and that kind of thing. So arguably RTO has some tremendously high costs in terms of being able to recruit and retain talent, and probably should be put up side by side against some of the benefits of having the whole team or the whole business unit in the office. So arguably maybe these are all just business decisions and we all just need to deal with it. But I think some of that internal calculus needs to be discussed, maybe a little bit deeper. So anyway, the link, like I say, is in the notes. But here is the New York Post kind of pulling up this concept again of quiet quitting and silent firing. And I've said it before, but you could make a good argument that maybe an RTO policy that's maybe quote unquote aggressive or sharp, requiring 5 days in the office per week, is that just a disguise? Is that just an organization saying, well, we don't want to fire people or let them go necessarily, but maybe we'll just let folks self-select out? And so maybe making policies that might make folks want to do just that. Get up, leave, sharpen the resume, hit the eject button, leave. Maybe a little easier than letting folks go and risking unemployment. Or the Warren Act, having to, let a whole gaggle of folks go at the same time. And then again, too, fair point, is a lot of this being really driven by AI, as companies struggle with how much staff do we need. Just recently, we've seen some layoffs. Dropbox here just is going through a round of layoffs. We're seeing a whole host of industries affected: video games, cloud technology, what have you. So again, I think that one's worth taking a deeper look at. And I'll pull up another one here too. This is CNN, but now this is just as of a couple days ago. We see job openings dropping a little bit. And so what does that say? And so we've got the largest drop-offs in openings falling into some categories that seem to have been high growth. And so that's kind of interesting, whether you want to look at BLS data or the JOLTS report, right? Healthcare, social assistant, government may be dropping a little bit. So if a major employer thinks that maybe there's a cooling job market, is RTO just maybe a disguise, perhaps, or a bit of a red herring, what have you. But again, I think that's worth taking a look at. Again, we've seen some historic revisions here in 2024 regarding data. And I'll put a pitch in, not only looking at national data, but wherever you are in your jurisdiction, is take a look at your state stats, or even a little bit deeper into municipal or county stats to see kind of where you're at in your own locality, in your jurisdiction. All right, moving on here just a little bit. There we go. Some parting advice. Yeah, previous slide there, also in my previous video there, I think kind of interesting, but that's in the notes there as well. But yeah, a few ideas here is, let's say you're at an employer that has an RTO policy, or maybe is thinking about revising that. So often that certainly worries folks, and certainly folks reach out to me when there are changes at an employer in terms of policy or updates that are kind of blanket. And oftentimes I find folks maybe haven't sketched out their own individual approach to RTO, as in, let's say your employer has a blanket policy. Well, what is your line in the sand? 3 days a week, 4 days a week, 5 days a week? Maybe map that out, or better yet, maybe share these ideas. And so somewhat commonly, I'll work with folks that don't truly have a good, solid understanding with their manager, whether that's a dialogue or a mutual action plan. So there's kind of a policy in place in regard to your situation. So for example, if you or my supervisor or manager, and we have a clearly agreed upon plan when I'm hired for, let's say, 4 days a week, well, a material change to that's not fair. That should be mutual. So maybe we should get ahead of this, as in when you sign an offer letter. Is it clear what's good policy in terms of how often you'll be in the office, physically present? If you have to travel, who pays for it? And so oftentimes I see these issues or these possible problems even in the offer letter itself. So there's that. Or a deeper level thought is, let's say you're a leader, you have a team of humans, maybe 5, 10 or more direct reports. Can you honestly say that there's a policy in place regarding your team? I think that's a really interesting dynamic. So let's say you're a supervisor or manager at Amazon or a tech company, and suddenly there's a corporate policy. However, do you have a policy related to your business unit or your team that's maybe a little bit different, a little bit special, and here's why? Can we make that business case so that you can attract the best possible talent and retain the best possible talent in the face of RTO? So a few thoughts to consider. Of course, maybe it's not a bad idea to keep calm and sharpen the resume, as I like to say sometimes. So, for example, lots of rankings of organizations that are more pro remote work or hybrid, kind of the opposite of RTO. And so I've got Zippia pulled up here, which I think is great. I've contributed to Zippia, or built in Seattle, built in San Francisco. There's some great lists there of employers that maybe are a little bit more friendly to the concept of remote work, or a little bit more flexible RTO policy that's coming down the pike. So is it wrong to rage apply when folks see a whole bunch of policy changes or a pretty massive policy change? I'd say probably not, but might be a little bit biased since I often help folks sharpen the resume, sharpen LinkedIn, and maybe look a little bit further afield. So there we go. Hopefully that gave you some things to think about, whether there's a defined RTO policy at your employer, and maybe there isn't. If not, maybe vocalizing that before it's too late and before a policy gets put into stone. That's going to be a little harder to negotiate, potentially. Or maybe you're up for a promotion, or next time there's a discussion around your role, your responsibilities, maybe something that should be negotiated for proactively is that, that flexibility and all that. I believe humans should be respected in terms of their time and how many hours they're required to be in a role, and hopefully there's some good communication around that for everyone. So if I gave you something to think about, great. If you see some articles on the topic you think I should take a look at, please share those. And as always, thank you for joining me. Let me know if I'm on target or if I'm way off base. And I would like to share a quick graphic there that was created with the help of AI. I think the one that you saw earlier is a little bit more, maybe less bonkers, but this is the first generation of it. And, gosh, as much as AI is affecting things, I'm kind of glad I didn't run with this thumbnail. But maybe this captures the chaos of a sudden shift to return to office. So I'm not sure if it's the Muppets in the crowd or some of the kind of odd graphics that we're seeing here, but maybe that's really the fog of RTO, is that suddenly it can just come out of nowhere, and medium or large size, small size employer can just come along and change things pretty radically and shift things a bit. And again, maybe a lot of this is just reactions to uncertainty in the job market, AI, maybe buyouts in disguise, what have you. That's a roundup of some of the sources that I typically cite. Again, the notes will be right there in the YouTube notes as well. If you feel like reaching out to me, absolutely feel free. Number, email address, all the deets. Feel free to follow me on the socials as well. And music again this time around, Ghostrifter, thank you so much. Very calm, chill hop mix. I appreciate that. Keeping me calm, cool, and collected here on Halloween. And again, thank you all, viewers, clients, supporters, students, everybody. And thank you, Canva, Microsoft Designer, Grammarly, PowerPoint. Did I say thank you, Ghostrifter? I think I did. All right, everyone. Have a safe Halloween, and I hope your Q4 isn't too much of a scramble. And we'll see you next time. Thank you much, everyone. Bye-bye.